What if you belong to a generation that learned how to live without needing the world to be connected 24/7? You knew how to entertain yourself before smartphones. You knew how to find your way without GPS. You knew what it felt like to wait for a song on the radio and to actually be unreachable. You grew up with freedom, a little boredom, and a lot of independence. Then the world changed, computers became normal, the internet arrived, cell phones became smartphones, and suddenly the childhood you remember started to feel like another world. If you were born around 1965 to 1980, you may recognize yourself in these 10 signs you're Gen X without even realizing it. And some of them might bring back memories you've completely forgotten. Sign 1, you remember when being unreachable was normal. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you probably remember when being unreachable wasn't a problem. You could leave the house for hours and nobody expected you to check in every few minutes. No smartphones, no location sharing, no constant notifications asking where you were. If someone needed you, they simply waited until you got home, and somehow life continued. You learned that not every message needs an immediate response and not every moment needs to be connected. Maybe that's why, even today, you sometimes enjoy putting your phone away and disappearing for a while. Because you remember a time when being unreachable didn't mean something was wrong. It simply meant you were living your life. Sign 2, you learned independence early. You may remember having more freedom at a surprisingly young age. You learned how to entertain yourself, solve small problems, and figure things out without someone constantly checking on you. You made plans with friends, you found your way home, you learned from mistakes. And sometimes you simply had to figure it out yourself. That early independence taught you something powerful. You could trust yourself. You didn't always need someone to tell you what to do because you learned by doing. And maybe that's why, even today when something goes wrong, your first instinct isn't always to panic. It's to think, okay, how do I fix this? Because you grew up learning that independence wasn't just a choice. It was part of everyday life. Sign 3, you know how to have fun without a screen. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you probably remember when entertainment didn't come from a screen. When you were bored, you went outside. You rode your bike, played with friends, listened to music, or simply found something to do. There was no endless scrolling, no streaming service, and no phone waiting to entertain you. You had to use your imagination. And sometimes being bored actually led to the best memories. That's why even today you may be comfortable sitting quietly without reaching for your phone. You learned something valuable before technology took over our attention. You don't need a screen to have a good time. Sometimes all you really need is your imagination, a little freedom, and someone to share the moment with. Sign 4, you remember using a landline. You probably remember when a phone was attached to the wall. If you wanted to call a friend, you dialed their home number, and if someone else answered, you had to politely ask, "Can I speak to Sarah?" Sometimes you even memorized phone numbers because there was no contact list to save them for you. In privacy, that was a whole different challenge. You might stretch the phone cord around a corner just hoping nobody else picked up another phone. Today, a smartphone can connect you to anyone instantly, but you remember when calling someone meant calling their house, not carrying the entire world in your pocket. And somehow those simple conversations felt more personal. Because when the phone rang, you never knew who was on the other end. Sign 5, you learned to fix things instead of replacing them. You probably grew up with the mindset that when something broke, you tried to fix it first. A loose handle, a broken appliance, a bicycle, even an old radio. You didn't automatically think, just buy a new one. You looked for the problem, you asked someone who knew how. You experimented, and sometimes you made it worse before making it better. But that's how you learned. You developed patience, resourcefulness, and the confidence to figure things out. Today, replacing something can be easier than repairing it. But you still remember a different mindset. If something is broken, it might not be useless. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to understand how it works. Sign 6, you remember music before streaming. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you remember when listening to music wasn't instant. You had records, cassette tapes, CDs, and the radio. You waited for your favorite song to come on and sometimes rushed to press record before the DJ started talking. You made mixtapes, shared albums, and listened to the same songs until you practically knew every word. Today, millions of songs are available with a few taps. But back then, music required patience, and because you couldn't access everything instantly, the songs you loved often felt more special. That's why an old song can suddenly play and instantly take you back decades. Because you're not just hearing music, you're hearing a piece of your past. Sign 7, you don't need to document everything. You probably remember when life didn't need to be photographed or posted. You could go on vacation, have dinner with friends, or watch a beautiful sunset without reaching for your phone. There was no pressure to share every moment. Some memories were simply yours. You experienced them and then carried them with you. Maybe that's why, even today, you don't feel the need to constantly post where you are or what you're doing. You understand that a moment doesn't become more meaningful just because other people see it. Because you grew up before life became a performance for an audience, some of the best memories are the ones nobody else ever saw. Sign 8, you learned technology later. Technology wasn't something you grew up with from day one. You remember life before personal computers became common, before the internet, before smartphones were everywhere. Then slowly technology started changing everything. You learned email, you learned computers, you learned the internet. Then mobile phones and eventually smartphones. You weren't born knowing how everything worked, you had to learn it. And maybe that's why you're not afraid of technology, but you also don't feel dependent on it. You've seen the world both ways. A world without constant connectivity, and the world we live in now. You didn't inherit the digital age, you adapted to it. Sign 9, you have a strong figure-it-out mentality. If something goes wrong, your first instinct may not be to panic. You think, okay, how do I fix this? You grew up in a time when not every problem had a quick online answer. If something broke, you looked at it, you asked someone, you experimented, you tried again. And sometimes you learned by making mistakes. That experience built a kind of quiet confidence. You don't always need someone to rescue you because you've learned that you can often find a solution yourself. Even today, when life gets complicated, you may naturally switch into problem-solving mode. Because somewhere along the way you learned an important lesson. You don't need to know everything. Sometimes you just need to be willing to figure it out. Sign 10, you miss a world that doesn't exist anymore. Sometimes you miss a world you know you can never get back. You miss quieter streets, kids playing outside until the streetlights came on. Knocking on a friend's door instead of sending a text, and evenings without everyone staring at a screen. You remember cassette tapes, landlines, paper maps, and a time when people weren't constantly connected. Maybe you don't actually want to go backward. You know technology has made life easier. But there are moments when you quietly think things felt different back then. Because you're not just missing an old world, you're remembering your younger self when life felt slower, simpler, and somehow more present. And that's why certain songs, smells, or old photographs can hit so deeply. They don't just remind you of the past, they remind you of a version of yourself you can never become again. You were raised in a different world. If these signs felt strangely familiar, there's a reason. You grew up during a time when independence was normal, privacy was expected, and boredom wasn't something people were afraid of. You experienced a world before smartphones, before social media, before everyone carried the internet in their pocket. And then you watched that world disappear. You adapted, you learned, you kept moving forward. But somewhere inside you still carry the child who rode a bike until sunset, who listened to music on a cassette, who knew phone numbers by heart, and who didn't need a screen to feel entertained. Maybe that's the beautiful thing about being Gen X. You remember the old world, but you survived the new one. You know what it feels like to be disconnected, and you know how to stay connected. You learned independence, but you also learned adaptation. And perhaps that's why when the modern world becomes too loud, too fast, and too connected, you still know how to step away. Because you remember something the modern world sometimes forgets. Life existed before the notifications, and somehow you knew how to live it. So here's the question. What's one thing from your childhood that you wish still existed today? Was it the freedom, the music, the neighborhood, the friendships? or simply the feeling of having less but somehow enjoying more? Share your answer in the comments. And if this video brought back memories like this video, share it with someone who grew up in the same era, and subscribe for more nostalgic psychology and generational content. Because the world may keep changing, but some memories never really leave us.